Emma Walker was no stranger to the city or the corporate world, but that day, when she arrived at the grand glass office that topped one of the tallest skyscrapers in Mexico City, she felt something different in the air. It wasn't just any morning, though the routine seemed the same. Dressed in her impeccable business suit, with her hair neatly tied in a bun, Emma walked through the halls with the same determination and elegance as always. She was a woman accustomed to carving her way through a male-dominated world, where every gesture, word, and glance counted. Over the years, Emma had earned respect and admiration. Not only for her flawless work record but for the intelligence and confidence with which she executed each project. From her modest start as an analyst to her rise to one of the most coveted executive positions, she had proven to be a woman of unwavering ethics and a clear vision of what she wanted to achieve. However, that day, things would take an unexpected turn that would test everything she had built. Upon entering the boardroom, where the weekly meetings were held, Emma noticed that the atmosphere was different. The executives were already present, engrossed in trivial conversations about the weekend, sports, and the bets many were placing on who would be the next to fall from grace in the company. Emma took her usual seat at the end of the long dark wooden table, a spot she preferred for the quiet it gave her to observe before intervening. The company's CEO, Arthur Richardson, entered with his usual air of authority. A self-made man who had built the empire from the ground up, and whose decisions were rarely questioned. With an imposing stature, his hair perfectly slicked back, and his gaze always fixed on the horizon, Arthur was an intimidating figure but also revered. His methods, though severe, had led the company to great success over the years. Yet that day, something in his behavior gave him away. He seemed upset, perhaps even a bit arrogant. Arthur walked towards his seat at the head of the table, but before sitting down, he suddenly stopped. His eyes landed on Emma, who, unbeknownst to her, was about to experience a moment that would change her life forever. "Marianita, why don't you bring us some coffee to start the week?" he said in a casual tone, but one that carried a condescending weight that shocked everyone present. Emma felt time stop. A sudden chill ran through her body as she heard that diminutive form of her name, one he had never used with her before, a name that infantilized her presence and diminished her authority. The other executives stared at her, and although some seemed uncomfortable, none said a word. Emma, a woman who had worked harder than many of those present to get where she was, now found herself in a humiliating and degrading situation. She took a breath, pressed her lips together, and stood up from her seat without saying a word. Every step towards the kitchen felt eternal. As she prepared the coffees, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Why had he done it? Why had she accepted it without protest? She knew that in that environment, any attempt to defend herself would be seen as a threat, an unnecessary confrontation that would only mark her as difficult. She returned to the boardroom with the tray of coffee in hand, trying not to show any signs of weakness. She handed out each cup with a professional smile that hid the anger boiling inside her. No one made any comments, but the tension in the air was palpable. As she sat down again, her mind was no longer on the meeting or the reports being discussed. Emma was far away, trapped in a series of thoughts that took her back to every moment she had been underestimated for being a woman, every time she had to prove twice as much to receive half the recognition. The meeting continued, but for Emma, each word she heard was another piece of a puzzle forming in her mind. Little by little, she began to notice patterns that might have gone unnoticed before. She realized that many of the important decisions made in the company were based more on impressions than on concrete data. The executive spoke with overflowing confidence, though behind that facade of certainty were gaps of information that no one seemed eager to fill. When the meeting finally ended, Emma stayed a few minutes longer in the room, looking out through the large windows that offered an impressive view of the city. As she watched the buildings and traffic below, she made a decision. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could change what came next. She stood up with firm steps, left the room, and walked directly to her office. The following days were complicated. Every time Emma crossed paths with Arthur or any of the other executives, she felt a growing tension. She had noticed that some of her colleagues were watching her out of the corner of their eyes, as if waiting to see her reaction, but Emma remained firm. She knew that any false move could jeopardize her career. However, something inside her had changed profoundly, and she was determined to prove her worth in a way that no one could ignore. Over the days, Emma began to dig deeper into the projects the company was working on. She had noticed inconsistencies in the data presented during the meetings, and her intuition told her something was wrong. She spent extra hours reviewing reports, discreetly contacting the company's engineers and analysts to get a more complete picture. What she discovered left her worried. The launch of a new technological device, which Arthur had enthusiastically announced, was full of flaws that had been ignored or downplayed by the top executives. The device they were about to launch had serious deficiencies that could lead to a catastrophic failure. Emma knew she had to act, but she couldn't do it alone. She spent the next few weeks gathering evidence, discreetly talking to employees who, like her, sensed something was wrong. She formed a network of allies in the shadows, people who also wanted to prevent disaster but feared the repercussions if they spoke up. Emma knew she was walking a tightrope. If she was wrong, she wouldn't just lose her job, but her reputation as well, something that had taken her years to build. But the alternative, watching the company crash due to the stubbornness of its leaders, was unacceptable. Armed with the information she had gathered, she decided it was time to act. One morning, during one of the weekly meetings, as Arthur confidently spoke about the imminent success of the launch, Emma stood up. The murmurs stopped immediately. All eyes turned to her, surprised by her sudden intervention. "Before we continue," Emma began, with calculated calm, "I think we need to discuss some limitations I've identified." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Some of the executives frowned, and Arthur, who until that moment had maintained an attitude of confidence, looked at her with surprise and disbelief. "What limitations?" he asked coldly. Emma took a deep breath and, maintaining her composure, began to expose the problems she had discovered with the project. She explained the compatibility issues, the inflated sales projections, and the ignored warnings from the engineers. As she spoke, the room was enveloped in tense silence. The other executives exchanged glances, some clearly uncomfortable. But Emma stood her ground, presenting each of her findings with irrefutable evidence. By the time she finished, the atmosphere in the room was almost suffocating. Arthur watched her in silence, his face impassive, but his eyes betrayed the internal struggle he was facing. For years, he had been the man whose word was law in the company. He wasn't used to being questioned, let alone in public, but Emma had left him no choice. The evidence was clear and compelling. "Are you suggesting we halt the launch?" he asked, his tone now much more serious. "I'm not suggesting it, I'm stating it," Emma responded, keeping her gaze steady on his. "If we don't make the necessary adjustments now, we risk a failure that could cost us much more than money, our reputation." Arthur leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. For the first time in years, he didn't have an immediate response. Emma had touched a nerve. He knew the project was flawed, but he had trusted that his name and the company's brand would be enough to guarantee its success. However, what Emma had revealed was something he couldn't simply ignore. "Very well," he finally said, his voice low but loaded with meaning. "We'll do as you suggest. We'll halt the launch and review everything. But I want quick results, Emma. We can't afford mistakes." Emma nodded, knowing she had won the battle, but also that the real war had yet to be fought. Arthur's support was crucial, but now she had to prove that her plan was viable. As the executives began to leave the room, still digesting what had just happened, Arthur approached her. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said in a tone softer than usual, "because if this fails, it will be your responsibility." "I know, Arthur," Emma responded, with a confidence she didn't entirely feel inside. "I won't let you down." The next week was a whirlwind of activity. Emma organized meetings with the engineering and marketing teams, working side by side with each department to identify the issues and seek solutions. She spent long hours in the office, reviewing reports and coordinating efforts among the different groups. The pressure was intense, and she knew everyone was watching, waiting to see if she would fail. One afternoon, while Emma was reviewing a technical report in her office, she received an unexpected visit. Eduardo, a young engineer who had been one of the first to warn about the project's flaws, entered with a serious expression. "Emma," he began hesitantly, "I just wanted to thank you for speaking up at the meeting. Not everyone would have had the courage to do what you did. Most of us knew something wasn't right, but no one dared to say it." Emma smiled, grateful for his words, though the weight of responsibility still pressed down on her. "Thank you, Eduardo. But this isn't just my fight," she replied. "We're all in this together. If we want things to change, we need to work as a team." Eduardo nodded, visibly relieved to know that someone in a position of power shared his concerns. But that interaction only reinforced Emma's determination. She knew she had to keep moving forward, and over time, she realized there were more employees like Eduardo, competent and valuable people who had been ignored or silenced by a system that privileged a few. Emma wasn't just correcting the project's course, she was starting a silent revolution within the company. She introduced policies to encourage the inclusion of ideas, regardless of rank or seniority, and promoted collaboration between different departments. She made an effort to listen to those who had previously had no voice, and little by little, things began to change. As the project moved forward, new challenges emerged. Emma discovered that many of the company's processes were based on hierarchies that stifled creativity and innovation. Employees felt suffocated, unable to propose ideas for fear of being judged or ignored. This only reinforced her conviction that deeper cultural changes were needed within the company. She organized workshops where employees from different levels and departments could collaborate openly, without the pressure of hierarchies. She implemented fairer and more transparent evaluation systems, eliminating old practices that favored older employees or those with connections in upper management. These changes were not welcomed by everyone, but Emma knew she was on the right path. In one of those workshops, a young analyst who rarely spoke up in meetings timidly raised his hand. "I think I have an idea to improve the device's performance," he said, his voice barely audible. Emma encouraged him to share his idea, and what he presented turned out to be a brilliant solution that no one had considered before. The room fell silent for a moment, but soon murmurs of approval began to fill the air. That was a turning point. Emma saw how the atmosphere was changing. Employees began to feel more confident in proposing ideas, and collaboration became an integral part of daily work. The company, which had once been a place of strict hierarchies and protocols, was now starting to transform into a space where every voice was valued. Over time, the company not only regained its position in the market, but exceeded expectations. The project Emma had salvaged was finally launched and became a resounding success. But for Emma, the real triumph wasn't just the success of the product, but the cultural shift she had achieved within the organization. The months that followed were a testament to Emma's personal and professional growth. Her relationship with Arthur also evolved. Although he remained a hard-to-impress man, he began to show her a respect that hadn't been there before. One day, as she walked through the office halls, Arthur called her into his office. "Emma," he began when she entered, "I have to admit, you've done more for this company in the past few months than many of us have in years." Emma, surprised by his words, looked at him with gratitude. "Thank you, Arthur. But this has been a team effort." He nodded, but his gaze conveyed more than his words allowed. "It's not every day I meet someone with the courage to challenge me and still be right," he added. "Keep doing what you're doing. This company needs it." Emma smiled, knowing that was the highest praise she could have received. The silent revolution she had initiated was far from over, but she knew that, with time and effort, her vision of a more inclusive, creative, and fair company was possible. As she left the office, a sense of calm washed over her. She knew that, for the first time in a long time, she was exactly where she needed to be. As time passed, Emma began to see how the changes she had implemented were not only affecting the day-to-day operations of the company but also the attitudes of those around her. Employees who had once been reserved started speaking up more in meetings. Ideas flowed more freely, and those who had previously felt marginalized now played an active role in decision-making. The environment was different, more collaborative and, in many ways, more humane. However, not everything was smooth sailing. There were moments when Emma felt overwhelmed by the responsibilities that now rested on her shoulders. Some weeks, internal tensions mounted. Older employees, those who had thrived under Arthur's previous regime, resisted the changes. Emma faced subtle criticisms, disapproving looks, and comments in the hallways that sought to undermine her authority. There were times when she questioned whether all the effort was worth it. On one occasion, a small group of executives close to Arthur, men who had benefited from his favoritism in the past, organized a meeting without notifying Emma. When she found out, she chose not to react immediately. She knew that a direct confrontation could cause a rupture in the progress she had achieved. Instead, she spoke with Arthur. "I heard about the meeting that took place this morning," she said calmly when they met in his office. Arthur looked at her, fully aware of what was happening. He wasn't blind to the internal maneuvering within the company, but he had learned to respect Emma enough to listen to her. "Are you worried about something in particular?" he asked, as if testing her resolve. Emma took a deep breath before responding. "I'm not worried about the meeting itself, Arthur. I'm worried about what it represents. The changes we've implemented won't be sustainable if people aren't committed to them. Closed-door meetings and decisions made without transparency aren't the path we're building." There was a moment of silence as Arthur looked at her intently. Emma could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. On one hand, the businessman who had maintained absolute control for years, and on the other, someone who was starting to recognize the value of a more collaborative approach. "I understand what you're saying," he finally responded. "I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Emma nodded, grateful for his response. She knew that trust wasn't earned overnight, but she also knew that small gestures like this made a difference in the long run. A few months later, the success of the new product solidified in the market. Not only had it met expectations, but it had exceeded them by far. The company began to be recognized not just for its technological innovation but also for its internal transformation. Business media outlets highlighted the cultural shift that had taken place under Emma's leadership. The Diversity and Inclusion Committee, which had been met with skepticism in its early days, became a fundamental part of the company's structure. The policies Emma had implemented not only improved the work environment but also attracted new talent. People who would have avoided working in such a rigid environment before now saw the company as a place where they could grow and be valued. Eduardo, the engineer who had once hesitated to speak up, became one of the leaders of the development team. Emma promoted him, recognizing his talent and leadership abilities. He was one of many employees who thrived under the new system, proving that when given the opportunity, they could achieve great things. One day, while walking through the halls, Emma stopped to see a group of young employees excitedly discussing a new idea for a project. She saw them smiling, laughing, and sharing ideas without fear. That scene reminded her why she had started all of this, to build a place where people could be themselves, where they wouldn't be afraid to speak up or propose something new. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction seeing that this place was finally taking shape. But there was still one task left, something Emma knew she had to face sooner or later. It was time to meet with Arthur to discuss the next steps. The company had grown, and the next challenge was to ensure that the changes wouldn't be undone over time. One Friday afternoon, Emma was called into Arthur's office. It had been a long time since they had a deep conversation about the direction of the company, and Emma knew this meeting would be decisive. "You've done an admirable job, Emma," Arthur began when she entered. "More than I expected, I have to admit." Emma nodded, waiting for him to continue. There was something different in his tone, as if there was more on his mind. But I want you to be aware that not everyone is as pleased with the changes as you and I are. There are people, both here and outside the company, who don't believe in the transformation we're making. Some are waiting for the right moment to reverse everything we've built. Emma knew this was true. She had felt the tensions, the murmurs of dissatisfaction among some board members, and the doubts of the more conservative investors. "What are you asking of me, Arthur?" she asked, watching him closely. He studied her for a moment before responding. "I'm asking you to be prepared. If we want this change to last, we need a long-term plan, something that ensures the company stays on this path even after I'm no longer here." Emma looked at him, surprised. She had never considered the possibility that Arthur wouldn't be leading the company, but she understood what he meant. They needed to consolidate the changes, institutionalize them so they became an integral part of the company's culture, not just the result of temporary leadership. "I understand," she finally responded. "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure this isn't just a temporary change. The company will move forward." Arthur nodded, visibly satisfied. "I trust you, Emma. You're the right person to lead this change. Just make sure that, no matter what happens, you don't lose sight of what really matters." In the following months, Emma worked tirelessly to ensure that the changes she had implemented became permanent. She put new processes in place, established review committees, and ensured that major decisions aligned with the values she had promoted. With each new success, the company solidified its position not only as a market leader but also as a reference in corporate culture. Eventually, the time came when Emma knew the company was ready to move forward without external interventions. The employees were committed, the processes were solid, and the culture of collaboration and inclusion was unshakable. Emma, with a mix of pride and nostalgia, knew that she had completed her mission. She had accomplished the impossible, transforming a rigid and authoritarian company into a place where people were valued for what they brought, not for their position in the hierarchy. One afternoon, while watching the sunset from her office window, she realized that her journey was complete. And although she knew that new challenges would always arise, she was certain that she had left a lasting mark, one that would guide the company toward a bright and promising future. Emma had reached a turning point in her career, but she couldn't imagine that her true test of leadership would come from an unexpected interaction. It was a rainy afternoon when she met Alejandra, a young assistant who had recently been hired by the company. Alejandra was reserved, shy, and seemed constantly nervous. Emma had seen her pass by her office several times, always with her head down, carrying documents or responding to orders from her superiors. One day, after leaving an important meeting, Emma noticed Alejandra sitting alone in the small break room, her eyes filled with tears. Emma, who had always been attentive to the internal dynamics of the company, felt an impulse to approach her. "Alejandra, are you all right?" Emma asked softly, sitting beside her. Alejandra looked up, surprised, and quickly wiped her tears with the sleeve of her blouse. Yes, I'm fine," she responded in a faint voice, clearly embarrassed. Emma knew that wasn't a sincere answer. It was an automatic response from someone trying to hide what they truly felt. She decided not to press too much but wanted Alejandra to know that she could count on her. "If you ever need to talk, I'll be in my office," Emma said with a warm smile, leaving it up to Alejandra to decide whether to open up or not. The next morning, to Emma's surprise, Alejandra appeared at her office with an unsure expression. "Miss Emma," she began, hesitating, "yesterday, when you offered to talk, I thought about many things, and now. I don't know if I should be here, but I feel like I have no one else to talk to." Emma gestured for her to sit and encouraged her to continue. Alejandra shared her story, a young woman from a small Mexican town, the first in her family to attend university. She had secured her job at the company through a scholarship, but since her arrival, she felt out of place. The derogatory comments from some colleagues, the constant pressure, and the lack of support had made her feel worthless. She had been considering quitting. "I feel like I'll never be enough to work here," Alejandra confessed, her eyes welling with tears. Emma felt a lump in her throat. Alejandra's story reminded her of her own journey. She, too, had to overcome others' disdain and doubts, and she knew what it was like to fight for a place in an environment that sometimes seemed unwilling to accept you. Alejandra, we've all felt that way at some point, Emma said, leaning forward. What you're feeling doesn't define you. You're much stronger than you think, and you have something many don't, determination. What you need is someone who believes in you, and I do. I know what it's like to be in your shoes. From that moment on, Emma took Alejandra under her wing. She started working with her, guiding her, showing her how to stand out in a competitive environment without losing her essence. Alejandra, though initially insecure, began to thrive under Emma's mentorship. Week after week, her confidence grew. Emma assigned her small tasks beyond her usual responsibilities, challenging her to give her best. Over time, Alejandra began presenting her own ideas in team meetings, contributing significantly to some of the company's most important projects. One day, during a brainstorming session, Alejandra proposed a revolutionary idea to optimize the distribution processes for the new product. Her idea was not only accepted but dramatically improved profit margins. Arthur, always attentive to what was happening in the company, began to notice Alejandra's growth. During a meeting with Emma, he remarked, "That young assistant, Alejandra, seems to be surprising everyone. It seems you've guided her well." Emma smiled. She felt immense pride for Alejandra, not only because she had proven her worth, but because she had found something deeper in her, a spark of confidence that no adversity could extinguish. Time passed, and one day, in an all-staff meeting, Arthur announced a series of promotions. Emma already knew some of the names that would be mentioned, but what she didn't expect was for Arthur to include one in particular. Alejandra Fernandez, for her dedication and exceptional contributions, will be promoted to the Special Projects Department. The room erupted in applause. Alejandra, visibly emotional, looked at Emma, who returned her gaze with a proud smile. She had witnessed Alejandra's transformation, from a timid young woman to a brilliant professional now recognized for her efforts. After the meeting, Alejandra approached Emma, tears in her eyes, this time, tears of happiness. "Thank you, Emma. I wouldn't be here without you," she said with a trembling voice. Emma, touched, replied, "No, Alejandra, you earned this place. I just showed you that you could do it." That outcome didn't just mark a happy ending for Alejandra but for Emma as well. Seeing how someone who had started so vulnerable had found her voice and her place in the corporate world was a confirmation for Emma that the changes she had implemented, the new environment of inclusion and respect, were bearing fruit. Weeks later, at the company's year-end party, Emma and Alejandra met again, this time in a more relaxed atmosphere. Music played, and festive lights filled the room. Emma watched as Alejandra conversed confidently with other executives, now respected by all. Alejandra approached Emma, this time without tears, but with a light-hearted laugh. "I promise I won't cry this time," she joked. Emma laughed. "I'm glad to hear that," she replied. They stood together for a moment in silence, watching the celebration around them. It was a reminder of everything they had gone through, the challenges they had faced, and the victories they had achieved together. "You know, Emma," Alejandra said, looking at the people laughing and dancing. "I never thought this place could feel like home, but now it does. And that's thanks to you." Emma looked at her, once again moved but also filled with hope. She had fulfilled her purpose of transforming not just a company but the lives of those around her. And in that moment, she knew that all the effort had been worth it. That ending, full of laughter and tears of joy, was the perfect close to a chapter that had not only changed Emma but also everyone lucky enough to cross her path. Alejandra's transformation was just a small part of the larger change Emma had sown, and with that, she